Well, welcome to a book or two to review, episode 29. I've done a lot of recording in the last couple of days, and this is the last one I'm doing before I'm packing up and hopefully going to another recording place for a few days. So, what is this book? The Spanish Civil War at Sea by Michael Alpert. Now, first things first, there are some nice pictures in it. And they're all period pictures, black and white, but that makes sense. What is interesting about it all is the lists it gives. And the information it has. And who goes where. One of the most interesting stories I find here is this chapter, a reorganization. Prado, however, had another essential task, to create an operations headquarters in the new naval base in Malaga. On 20th of July, when the government had dissolved naval staff, it had left only the operations section under Lieutenant Prado. 5 other officers had been appointed to the section, but all had refused the posts. Lieutenant Antonio Ruiz had been appointed to command the Cartagena Naval Base, and a senior warrant officer, Nicanor Mendez, would head the base at Port Mahon. Commanders for the ships also had to be appointed. These had to be men who knew the crews and whom the latter trusted. The only captains who retained their posts were Commander Valentino Fuentes of the destroyer Lampanto and Commander Jose Garcia Freire of the destroyer Lasagna. However, given that the latter remained in the Navy after Franco's victory in 1939, and in fact later reached the rank of Admiral, his presence on the bridge of a Republican ship can be assumed to be counterproductive, and he was soon removed from command. Doubt about the loyalty of officers was clashing with the sheer shortage of competent men. The following officers were placed in the command of the ships: battleship and cruisers. The Jaime Primero, Midshipman Carlos Esteban. Cervantes, Lieutenant Commander Federico Monreal. Libertad, Commander Fernando Navarro. Destroyer flotillas: Lieutenant Vicente Ramirez de Tormes. The Sanchez Basengos. Sub-Lieutenant Alvaro Calderon. Almirante Valdez, Lieutenant Fernando Olivia Lemusio. Alasia Galeno, Lieutenant Eugenio Cardona Martinez. José Luis Diaz, Lieutenant Commander Luis González de Obedido. Almirante Fernandez, Sub-Lieutenant José Luis Bavisto. Almirante Miranda, Lieutenant Commander Nicolas Bueno Borgo. Chiricoro, Lieutenant Manuel Nunes Rodriguez. Alisto, Sub-Lieutenant Federico Vival Cubas. The set of junior officers commanding destroyers and even a battleship was the Jaime I so politicized that only a midshipman was second to the crew, subordinate to a middle-ranking officer as fleet commander, and a lieutenant as head of operations, reflects the problems the Republic had reorganizing the Navy. This is one of those scenarios where you're reading it and you're reading the book, and so much is put together that you see from different sections. you know, in the introduction, the Royal Navy, the heavy presence of warships around the coast of Spain was liable, it was feared, to provoke a major European war. Britain, in particular, tried hard to ensure the Spanish War did not lead to a general conflict. In this, the role of the British Foreign Office and Royal Navy in trying to prevent arms shipments to Spain, but to protect legitimate trade by sea, was primordial. In the Spanish War, the activity of German warships and the participation of Italian submarines in particular created a heavy burden for the Royal Navy, which in later 1930s was competing for funds with other armed services. After 1919's heavy financial cuts were imposed on the Royal Navy, to this were added the effects of decisions of the 1921-1922 Washington Conference. Faced with the threat of an arms race, pacifism at home, and economic stringency, the Royal Navy was also to be limited in its parity with other navies. The British government adopted the so-called 10-year rule, which assumed that Britain would not be faced by a major war over a self-perpetuating 10-year period. This was seen as a correct policy in a decade which hoped that the war to end all wars, as the 1914-18 conflict became known, would indeed mean an epoch of international peace, in which disputes would be arbitrated by the League of Nations. German militarism had been vanquished, France's security was guaranteed by the Locarno Agreement of 1924, and the great powers had renounced war as an instrument of national policy. So much so. We will never make war as part of our policy of international relations. Unless we have to. But we won't make it just because we feel like it. But only because we have to. And we'll, of course, never have to. Because of the League of Nations. Where everything is designed to be by consensual and require agreement. Has no ability to enforce actions unless the other members decide to, well, wage war to enforce them. However, the British Far East Empire remained the major concern of the Royal Navy. The annual report of the Chiefs of Staff in 1927 had laid down the principle that no anxieties in the Mediterranean could be allowed to interfere with the dispatch of a fleet to the Far East if required. Restated in 1929, the Royal Navy's duty was established as to ensure freedom of passage to all parts of the Empire. Freedom of passage to all parts of the Empire. That's a major commitment. And the question of the role of the Royal Navy affected policy in Europe also. Ships sailing to the Far East steamed through the Strait of Gibraltar and via Malta and the Alexandria and Suez. But the Far East was the greatest concern. In 1930, Ramsay MacDonald, the Prime Minister and Chairman of the International Naval Conference, wrote to the King, Great Britain must not take on further responsibilities and must not be put in a position of having to act mechanically without freedom of judgment should trouble arise in Europe. In 1931, the Admiralty complained that the Royal Navy had been seriously weakened, both relatively to other countries and in absolute terms. It was questionable whether the Navy could provide cover against Japan while retaining a deterrent force sufficient to prevent the strongest European naval power, presumably Italy, from obtaining control over areas essential to British export and import trade, the Mediterranean, at a time when Britain imported half of its food. In early 1934, after Hitler's takeover and Germany's withdrawal from the Disarmament Conference, the Defence Requirements Committee gave as its view that Germany was now the greatest danger in Europe. Whilst this stimulated the urgency of spending on the Army and the Air Force, Neville Chamberlain, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, was unwilling to disburse the huge sums needed for capital ship construction. By the end of 1933, however, the 10-year rule had been allowed to lapse. The Committee for Imperial Defence began to prepare a programme to meet the worst deficiencies, and as the months passed, the European threat increased, leading France and the Soviet Union to sign a Treaty of Mutual Assistance in the face of Hitler's repudiation of the Treaty of Versailles. His remilitarization of the Rhineland in March 1936, and the establishment of the German-Italian Axis of November 1936. Yay, France and the Soviet Union have lined up. Just as the moment when both countries were taking a major part on Franco's side in Spain. The establishment of the German-Italian Axis in November 1936, just at the moment when both countries were taking a major part at Franco's side in Spain. Rearmament was not a mere question of throwing money at shipbuilding yards. In the 1920s and during the Depression of the 1930s, plants had been allowed to decay, skilled labour had been lost to areas which offered work to the unemployed, and firms had closed. Furthermore, the Labour Party had opposed the Defence White Paper of 1st March 1935. Thank you, Labour Party. The Axis threat was obvious. Germany had reintroduced conscription in February 1935, As one naval historian sums up pivotally, the spectre of hostile Germany, Italy, and Japan was to condition all British naval thinking and planning for the next 5 years. It makes sense. Any one of those was a threat. Any two of them were a bad dream. All three was the world's worst nightmare. These years would include Mussolini's campaign to take over the Kingdom of Abyssinia and the Spanish Civil War. In the former, if effective sanctions, such as blocking the Suez Canal to Italian forces, were to be effective, Malta and Alexandria might well suffer attack, and while the Royal Navy was confident they could deal with any threat from the Italian Navy, Britain could not afford losses. As Sir Robert Vansittart, the permanent Undersecretary of the Foreign Office, wrote to the Foreign Secretary, Sir Samuel Hoare, and to Admiral Chatfield, the First Sea Lord and Chief of Naval Staff. This country has been so weakened of recent years that we are in no position to take a strong line in the Mediterranean. We should be very cautious as to how far and in what manner we force to place with an unreliable France and an unready England. Unready because you haven't put the effort into it. But what I find always interesting about those accounts, especially with the ones facing off against Italy, the officers actually in the Mediterranean were more sanguine about their chances. They felt the issue was more when new Italian battleships started to come into service. They thought the Italian fleet they were dealing with now, they could probably take out quite quickly. They had some upgraded ships, yes, but they had an advantage. Germany didn't have much in the way of anything actually at sea, so they weren't going to need battleships to face off against them, so they could afford to put the full might. And there was no rumours that Japan and Italy were going to hook up at all at this point. So, yeah, push it with Italy. It's one of the interesting points of war is what happens if Britain and Italy do end up in a war in 1935 and Hitler did nothing. Because Hitler's an opportunist. And in 1935, is it looking good for him to do things? Probably not. And if the British take out the Italians, well, does it strengthen the French? Do they feel stronger, better allies with the British? What does it do for Franco? Thus, it is probable that Britain's weak reaction to the Italian invasion of Abyssinia in 1935 encouraged Mussolini to involve Italy in aiding Franco in 1936, in particular at sea and with shipments of armament and men. And this is another thing that has to be remembered. Mussolini is the leading fascist power at this point. Not Hitler, not Germany. It's Italy which is the leading fascist power. They're the dangerous ones. Germany's beginning its rearmament. They've had plans for a while, but they're not doing anything massive. It's Mussolini which is the worrying one. I love the way the next section is titled The Spanish Navy in the 20th Century. It should almost be titled The Spanish Navy and the 20th Century. This is just a book you read through and you just go from event to event to event. And it's a glorious construction. It is a wonderful read. It's some really interesting history. And there's this section here, the Basques create a navy. Within a few weeks of the onset of war, the three warships which the insurgents retained, the battleship España, the cruiser Almirante Cervera, and the destroyer Velasco, as well as numerous armed trawlers, had established control over the sea adjacent to the narrow Republican shore and hinterland of northern Spain. A Republican fleet in the Cantabrian consisted of the destroyer José Luis Driz and the torpedo T3, the submarine C2 and C5. Sub-Lieutenant Carlos Moya, who had survived the massacre of imprisoned officers, was in command of the José Luis Driz. The ship experienced frequent breakdowns, with its officers, also after deserting to the insurgents, would claim to have been caused intentionally. The C2 was commanded by Lieutenant Eugenio Calderon from a Republican and Liberal family, but its deficiencies allowed it to remain submerged for only 2 hours. The other submarine, the C5, was commanded by the pro-insurgent Lieutenant Commander Lara, was in poor condition and spent most of the time moored close to a railway tunnel, to which the demoralised crew retreated during air raids. So bad was the situation that an armed Basque patrol took over the C5 when the crew was in the tunnel, possibly with the connivance of the guard, who told the story to a later insurgent investigation. The submarine disappeared without known cause on the 30th of December 1936. However, after the war, evidence was produced that Lara had probably sunk his submarine intentionally. Since October 1936, the Basque region had been autonomous and known as Uzekti. The Basque authorities, unimpressed by the discipline and capacities of the Republican ships, organised their own naval force with 6 armed deep-sea trawlers. 4 of these, which normally fished on the codbacks of Newfoundland, were named Biscakia, Araba, Nabra, and Gibsut, and crewed by tough Basque fishermen organised as the Volunteers of the Sea, or Voluntario del Mar. In addition, 24 fishing boats were equipped as minesweepers to keep the approaches to Bilbao free of mines. Sort of remind me of the Sea Fencibles and the Royal Navy Volunteers. It's a book worth reading. It is a book which is full of rich history and interesting to read. What would I add? The 1920s and 1930s are complicated. They are complex period. And we can decry many decisions made and go, well, they should have been doing this and this in hindsight, because hindsight becomes very clear. Thanks to 1941, Britain ends up in war with all 3 of them: Japan, Italy, and Germany. L3. Now, you can argue Britain should have seen that coming, and to an extent, some did. But that is the nightmare scenario. That is the nightmare scenario. Did they foresee the fall of France? No. The fall of Norway. And the fall of France has more consequences than just in Europe. The fall of France leads to the fall of French Indochina to Japan, which moves Japan a lot closer to Malaysia. Trouble is, at the same time as Japan's coming closer to Malaysia and Singapore, Britain is also fighting a very large war in North Africa, in Europe, in the Mediterranean, in the South Atlantic, North Atlantic, and Indian Ocean, because surface raiders visit them all. There is a paucity of options. I have been talking a lot in videos recently, and I'm probably going to be talking about again, about my personal belief, and this in many ways is guiding me to write a book on sloops because I want to look at their history, that Britain should have taken advantage of the treaty, the grey spot in the naval treaties that are ships which are not destroyers, not designed for more than 20 knots, allowed to be up to 2,000 tons, so destroyer sized, but they're limited in terms of their numbers of surface guns, and well, in destroyer sized guns they're limited, and they are limited in terms of they're not allowed torpedoes. Those are big limits. But I often think Britain should have started ordering sloops in large numbers earlier. When they started the destroyer building program in 1928 is normally when I start saying they should be ordering destroyers, some sloops. More importantly than that, they do try and build some sloops abroad, but it's very late in the game. They try and build some in India and some in other nations. Again, if in 1928 they started building sloops, Okay, they're not destroyers, but they are built to military standards, although the simplest of them. And they would have still been useful in World War II for anti-submarine operations and convoy escorts. They could have built them in Britain. They could have built them in Canada, Australia, India, Singapore, South Africa. They could have built them all around the empire. And then let's say 1937. You decide that the threat's really getting big. You decide to start building more destroyers. You've suddenly got a lot more yards around the world that can churn out destroyers. Now, why does that matter? Well, imagine Force Z, even without even an aircraft carrier, but with more destroyers as escort. Maybe even some sloops, but probably destroyers. Because they've been able to build more. And if you start if you have already had 9 years experience building sloops, then building a destroyer, it's going to be a jump up, but it's not a massive jump up. You've had nearly a decade to develop the industry and technology and the experience necessary to build it. So you can build it. So maybe you get a few extra flotillas of destroyers as well as a lot of sloops. Having all those sloops is going to reduce losses to the convoys, but also going to reduce strain on your escort force of destroyers from having to escort so many convoys. Which means you have both a large number of flotillas of destroyers and you have slightly less pressure on them because you have more escorts. That means you have more destroyers to go around, which means you probably send an enhanced or a couple of flotillas with Force Z. It might also mean, and this is going to sound terrible, but it might mean, I don't know, Glorious, Courageous, and Ark Royal still around because they'd have had more destroyers with them. They might have, and that might have stopped them being sunk. It might not have, but it might have done. And all this comes back to the decision not to build sloops. And that decision is taken by governments in 1928, 1929, 1930, all those times they're not building flotillas of sloops when they can under treaties. They're saving the money. The moment they sort of dropped the 10-year rule in 1932, and the reason they're not making that decision is because if you're looking at it, the only reason you need sloops is that to fight the Italian fleet? No, because if you're fighting the Italian Navy, you seal off Alexandria, you seal off Gibraltar, and you fight the fleet in the middle. You're not convoying through the Mediterranean, you're blocking their submarines off from getting out elsewhere. Then you don't need to worry about your merchant fleet as well. And if you're fighting the Japanese, well, you block them off from Singapore and you keep them in the Far East and hope they don't try and come through the Panama Canal. Well, the Americans should stop doing that, just about. And if they're coming down to the South Atlantic, you probably have a force based around the Falklands to go, hello, what are you doing here? Either way, sending submarines all the way across the Pacific, around South America, and into the South Atlantic to try and get to the trade, well, good luck to them. If a submarine survived that journey, you'd be very impressed. So, that leaves the only likely threat that you need those escorts for is Germany. And that's the last threat to materialize, really. Italy. Japan's been considered on the threat radar since the 1920s. Italy, with the rise of Mussolini and the spending and the aggression and the other things, becomes a threat in the early 1930s, if not late 1920s, early 1930s. Hitler rises to power in the 1930s. He's late on the scene. So there isn't a justification. But in hindsight, there is. And if you consider some of the intelligence, there is. But intelligence can be mercurial. And why does it all matter with the Spanish Civil War? Because, again, go to the Spanish Civil War and think about it. If the British had taken a harder line with Mussolini, they felt more confident to. If they'd had more sloops to wander around and help with assisting of investigating ships and merchant ships which looked to be breaking the rules, all those sort of things. Well, if you lose a sloop, that's not going to affect the fighting power of the fleet. You lose a destroyer, that's becoming an issue. You lose a cruiser, that's a big problem. You lose a battleship, ouch! They were worried about losing essential units of war. What does that mean? It means they don't have enough, for want of a better phrase, of the expendable units. You don't want to lose crews, you don't want to lose ships. But if it's a sloop, if your choice is between a sloop being risked or a battleship, you're going to risk the sloop. Because you lose that, that doesn't really shift the balance anyway. Spanish Civil War gets as bad as it does because someone decided not to build sloops for the Royal Navy in numbers in 1928. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed and I hope you found it interesting. Take care.